Is my base case still a severe recession with corresponding asset deflation? And bonds, the most attractive asset? Well, let me be very, very clear. I like T-bills. I would not buy 10-year, 30-year, although I think if you're really trying to speculate, that might be a decent speculation, but I wouldn't do it. Not with my money. I just like T-bills because I think it's a good place to park dry powder. So I do think that we're going to have a severe recession. But like I said at the beginning of the live stream, I don't know that it's going to happen tomorrow. I think we just have to see more and more good news before the rug pull. But I do think we're going to get the rug pull. How do I think World War III could impact home prices and USD COP? Well, I'm assuming you're talking about home prices in the United States. I mean, I don't know how it could. I don't know how it could increase prices, but I would have said that about a global pandemic as well. I think it really depends on how involved the actual United States is. I mean, this is like World War II when we're pretty much fighting battles on in other places. Maybe. I mean, if they're doing a lot of stimulus and they're doing, who knows, right? When the government comes in and distorts the market to that degree, which again is kind of goes back to what I was saying before. It's, fiat's not great, but the real problem there is government spending. And even if I don't want to go off on a tangent again, but even if the argument is, well, the fiat allows the government to spend, no. You got to do more homework there. You got to look at the Fed's balance sheet, and you've got to look at the balance sheet of the federal government, and you're going to see that there's very, 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 very low correlation, especially when you look at the amount of reserves in the system. But anyway, back to your question here. If the hot war was in the United States, I mean, we're talking about like something that looked like the 1800s in the Civil War. Oh my gosh, I can't even fathom, honestly. I can't even. It's hard for me to even go there because obviously I'm an American, and yeah, you're just talking about Mad Max, and I mean, heaven forbid. I mean, I think even if you're an atheist, you got to pray that never ever happens, and we got to do everything in our power to make sure that we are avoiding that scenario. And I'm not talking about, oh, well, it's great to fight a war as long as it's not in the United States. No, I'm just talking about war in general, World War III in general. I don't care where it's being fought. Looking over at the USD, I can't imagine that the USD versus the peso wouldn't explode higher because, I mean, USD is like the ultimate risk off. And I can't imagine how that wouldn't be possibly the biggest risk-off event of our lifetime. What's crazy is commodity prices could skyrocket as well. I'd have to really think that through. Now, I don't have to think about USD versus COP. That's a no-brainer. The peso would get crushed. I mean, you're talking about, I mean, right now we're at what, 4,500? I think you're looking at 6,000. I mean, you're looking at the DXY at 120, I think maybe minimum. But I do think in that environment, you could see, I know I've gone off on a mental tangent here, but I do think you could see commodity prices go up actually. Well, it's very counterintuitive with the dollar screaming just due to the supply side. But I'd have to think that through. Bottom line is I think USD would rip against every currency. Have I ever watched Aswath Damodaran's talk on smart versus dumb money? No. Why hasn't the Fed sold off more of the balance sheet? Can they manipulate stock bond prices with QT? No. This kind of goes back to the whole slavery question. And I don't really have time to explain it fully, and it gets very esoteric, but I'd really encourage people to think about the monetary solar system. 99.99999% of people out there, even super smart market participants, believe the Federal Reserve is the sun in that solar system. And the banking system is just the Earth revolving around the Federal Reserve sun. It's the opposite. It's the opposite. The Fed is actually the Earth, and the sun is the commercial banking system. They are the center of the monetary solar system. So the Fed really, it can do things, And obviously, as a result of doing quantitative easing, as an example, in 2020, we had M2 go up significantly. But there was a lot of other factors at play, such as people drawing off a credit line, which would go back to the banking system. But usually in normal times, the Fed is, I would argue, almost irrelevant. You say, well, George, well, they can manage how many reserves are in the system and they can expand the balance sheet capacity of the banks. And if they're doing QE, it adds all this liquidity. And if they're doing QT, it takes out all this liquidity. Nope. You've got to understand, you've got to start with the premise that there is nothing constraining the bank's balance sheet. Zero, except for counterparty risk. I think there's a good argument, a decent argument for regulation, but I still would say that they're going to be 10 steps ahead of the regulators at all times. So if the banks want to create liquidity, they're going to create liquidity. They don't need the Fed for that. If they want to buy stocks or buy bonds, if the market wants it, they're going to do it. You got to think about it this way. Imagine you're a hedge fund and you've got all these treasuries on your balance sheet. But you go into a meeting on a Monday morning and you say, you know what? I would really like to start buying stocks. I think it's risk on and stocks are a good place to be. Are you going to sit there and say, oh my gosh, you know what? I'd love to buy these stocks, but unfortunately I can't because I've got all these stupid treasuries. So what we're going to have to do is we're just going to have to wait for the Fed to do another round of quantitative easing so they can buy all these treasuries from us. And then once the Fed buys all these treasuries, then thank goodness we're going to have the liquidity we need to now go in and buy all these stocks that we really want to buy right now. See, when I say that out loud, it sounds ridiculous. But for some reason, we think this is the way the system works. So go back to that hedge fund. If they want to buy stocks right now, what are they going to do? Well, number one, they're going to sell the treasuries. But even if they don't want to sell the treasuries, they're just going to put them out in repo and get the cash. They're just going to use them as collateral. You say, George, but we're looking at the system in aggregate total. The Fed controls how much cash is in the system, therefore liquidity. So even if they go into repo, they're going to have to borrow it from someone else that has cash as a result of the Fed. No. Again, that assumes that the banks are somehow constrained, and they're not. If they want to provide that liquidity in repo, they're going to do it. Why? Because they can create dollars, infinite dollars. The only thing that constrains them is if they think they're going to get paid back or if there's a risk reward. They can create dollar assets. They can create dollar liabilities. They don't have to settle on the Fed's balance sheet. They don't need bank reserves to settle. They can settle between themselves. And this is very, very, very complex. And it's tough to get your head around because it's so wildly counterintuitive. And it flies in the face of everything that we are taught from day one. But if you start with that premise, you can answer a lot of these questions on your own. So let's go back to it here. Why hasn't the Fed sold off more of the balance sheet? Well, I mean, I think they're just letting things roll off their balance sheet. They're just allowing things to mature. And I think they understand how important the collateral is. So they're making sure that they're, if anything's rolling off, it's mostly mortgage-backed securities. I would assume that's what they're doing. But I don't know specifically why they haven't allowed more of it. Now, can they manipulate stock and bond markets with QT? Mechanically, no. So let me answer your question directly. Mechanically, no. Psychologically, yes. That's the key. That is the key. And there I would agree with you that psychologically, now all of a sudden, all the players in the market that actually can create liquidity and do all these things with their balance sheet, now all of a sudden they're like, woo, risk on. I'm going to lend. I'm going to create all these dollars, bam, bam, bam. Not because they have more bank reserves or fewer bank reserves or whatever. It's simply because they're like, aha, the Fed is doing XYZ. Therefore, they're giving me this signal that if I take way too much risk and I'm systemically important, that they're going to bail me out. So why wouldn't you take on That's the moral hazard. The problem with the Fed isn't that they're facilitating liquidity or quote unquote money creation. That's not the problem with the Fed, and it is a massive problem, is that they manipulate the price of money at the front end of the curve, not really the long end, because then you say, George, well, if they got interest rates artificially low, that's going to increase the money supply because banks are going to lend more because there's going to be more demand. Not really. Let's go back to QE 1, 2, and 3. When they wanted to lower the long end of the curve by doing QE, what happened to the long end of the curve? Yields went up, not down. The opposite of what the Fed wanted, because they don't really control that long end of the curve. So the bottom line there is from a psychological standpoint, or I'm sorry, the two cardinal sins is one, micromanaging the price of money at the front end of the curve. But I don't really think that applies to liquidity nor dollars being created to a significant degree. And then number two, bailouts. Bailouts create the moral hazard. Bailouts, I think it goes right back to long-term capital management. And this is a thought experiment that I've done many, many times, where I think, okay, if they never would have bailed out long-term capital management, if they never would have bailed out the systemically important banks or whatever, the G-SIBs during 2008, if they would just let people fail, let the free market work, but yet they also did QE, would that have done anything to the stock market? Obviously, there's no way of telling for certain, but my base case is no. QE wouldn't have done a thing. It would have been just like Japan. I think the power of QE has nothing to do with mechanics, everything to do with psychology, because it's them signaling to the market that, hey, you can take way, way, way more risk, because if you do fail, we're going to bail you out.